Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about James Franklin and some very troubling allegations against him about possibly interfering with some medical decisions around the Penn State program. Definitely not what you want to hear, but we'll see what happens with that, and we'll definitely update you with that as it kind of comes out. But let's talk about USC, and let's talk about them going into the Big Ten. We talked about Oklahoma into the SEC early last week or early this week. I can't exactly remember. But I wanted to go over to the Big Ten, and I feel like USC might be the most interesting team going into the Big Ten for a number of reasons. So let's start to break this stuff down and get into why I think this is. So Lincoln Riley has obviously made a huge jump this offseason. He has made probably what is the biggest single decision of any coach across the country this offseason, which is essentially just change what he's about. Change the way that his program goes about business, change the way that they practice, change the way that they lift in the locker room. The way they do very specific things has all got to change. And I think we all understand that. Watching Lincoln Riley over the last 6-7 years, it's the same formula. It's the team that if they're not going to outscore you, they're going to lose, and that's just the way it is. They're going to have to run up the score a lot of the time. They're not going to have a ton of defense that is going to play really aggressively, but he's trying to change that. He's finally figured out that that is not necessarily a way that you're going to win a title, and he's taken a big step to kind of fix that and bringing in DeAnton Lynn. I think this is one of those guys that is one of the biggest risers in our sport right now. Will definitely be will definitely be talked about much more as we kind of go throughout the next couple of seasons with USC. But he's coming over from UCLA, which is definitely something USC fans probably loved about that. And every single video, every interview, every practice you see from this guy, you really want to play for him. He's just one of those guys that's very infectious, that has that energy about him that you can understand why guys really respond to him. And they just picked up a big-time transfer in Gavin Mayer over from Wyoming, a defensive lineman that will definitely help them out next to Bear Alexander. But when you talk about the UCLA defense and what DeAnton Lynn did to it is just insane. They were 87 in 2022 overall, and they were number 11 in the country a year ago. And that's not necessarily with the most outright incredible talent. Now, they did have Liatu Latu, who was the top defender off the board in this NFL draft, but beyond that, they didn't necessarily have a ton of big-time players. It wasn't like the Michigan defense that had dudes all over the field. There were definitely a couple of gaps, but he made it all work. They were first in the nation in rushing defense, allowing a little under 70 yards a game. They were second in yards per rush. They were third in nation in sacks per game, with a little bit more than 3. So this guy knows how to coach defense, is the bottom line here. This guy knows what he's doing on the defensive side of the ball, and he does not shy away by any means of creating a very hard-nosed team. When we watched UCLA a year ago, it felt like they had a chip on their shoulder at every second of the day. And I think DeAnton Lynn was a huge reason for that. I think there was just an energy in that locker room. There was an energy in those facilities that was a little unlike anything they've ever had. And frankly, I think Deshaun Foster is going to keep that going over there because he has just insane amounts of energy as well. Love those two guys in this industry going forward. But the reality is DeAnton Lynn coming over to USC is huge, not only because he can call a great defense, but because he's going to get guys right. If you're not right, you're going to find your way out the door. And that's just kind of the way it works around there. We saw a ton of guys leave this past offseason, and I don't think there was necessarily as big of a worry around USC as there was everywhere else looking at USC. I think a lot of people were watching that saying, well, they're in trouble again. They're going to be a terrible defense again. And I didn't necessarily see it that way. I think a lot of guys left that had to leave. I think a lot of guys left that weren't willing to do some of the things that had to be done for them to win football games. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't lose a couple of big-time players. I think losing Tackett Curtis was a huge loss for them. Definitely would have been a big-time player for them. But the reality is, when you're making this big of a flip, when you're totally flipping your culture on its head and you're trying to play more hard-nosed defensive style football, some guys just aren't going to fit the mold, and that's just kind of the way of things, and you have to take that as you will and continue to move forward. So USC, when you look at the defense from a roster perspective, it's not the craziest thing in the world. There's no two ways about that. They definitely are not at the place that they want to be, but when you have guys like Bear Alexander, when you brought in Gavin Mayer, it's an absolutely huge pickup. When you have Eric Gentry, a very talented linebacker, there are some things that you can do on defense that I think some people might just be assuming USC can't do because they're USC and because it's Lincoln Riley. And to be honest, I kind of understand that. I understand not being super inclined to believe that Lincoln Riley can put together a hard-nosed team, but he's making every single step to do that. And he's doing it way quicker than I thought he would, if I'm being totally honest. It feels like everything I watch out of USC right now just has a little bit different energy. It's not necessarily to say that they've entirely flipped that thing and they're going to be a dominant defense by any means. In fact, they'll probably be a little bit below average this upcoming year on defense. Not necessarily bad like they were a year ago, which I think they were 117th in the country or something like that. But I think they'll be good. And I think part of that is just when you're watching practices with this USC team, there's an energy on that field that hasn't been there in the past. There is a certain anger that these guys play with that has not been there in the past, especially on Lincoln Riley's teams. And it's something that, doesn't necessarily mean too much until you get on the field, obviously, and doesn't necessarily mean too much until you do something with it. But it feels like the energy around that program is different. It feels like they are really buying into this new culture, this new way of things for Lincoln Riley and for USC. And I think it's going to pay dividends. When you look at Lincoln Riley, he's going to score points. There's very, very little chance that he does not score a lot of points this upcoming year. Obviously, facing some tougher defenses, dealing with some things that he didn't have to deal with in the past. But when you have Lincoln Riley on your staff, you're going to score a good amount of points. You're going to be one of the top 25, 20 offenses in the country. And then you just got to play opportunistic defense, right? You don't necessarily have to be the dominant defense that UCLA was a year ago. You just have to make the right plays at the right times. And obviously that's easier said than done. But I do think there are a number of people out there in SoCal that can make those plays. And I think bringing DeAnton Lynn in is an absolutely huge hire. Now, what does all this mean for 2024? It's hard to say. I don't really have a good idea of what they're going to look like in 2024. Overall, are they ready for the Big Ten right this second? I'd probably say no. If we're talking about the physicality perspective, or if we're talking about being able to keep up with these teams on a weekly basis, I tend to believe that the answer is going to be no. But I think that's just right now. I think if we're going into 2025, 26, 27, I think you're going to see an entirely different USC program. And I think you're going to see them be a big-time part of the conversation in the Big Ten going forward. I think people don't fully understand. I mean, I think a lot of people understand this, but the reality is you hit 1 year at USC and a lot of stuff takes care of itself, where you have a lot of guys portaling in. The recruiting becomes a lot easier to Southern California once you start winning those games. And it might not be in 2024, but I do think coming down the road, you're going to see a USC team that is just a little bit different than it has been in the past, and a Lincoln Riley that is a little bit different than it has been in the past. So everything they need is at USC, and more is coming over the next couple of years. But I don't think they're necessarily ready right this second, but USC isn't going to be a big topic of conversation in the Big Ten going forward. And I think the defense will be more than fine in a couple of years, but 2024 might be a little bit tougher. But let's take our last break here. And when we come back, we're going to do a Hot Take Thursday. We're going to break down the Heisman ceremony and how I think we might just have a very diverse group of guys up there from a position perspective, and definitely want to break that down right after this, so stick with us.